Are we lost? I hope we're not lost. One set of trees didn't look much different from another. Once in a while, they would cross a brook, but those mostly looked the same as well. Florine gripped her reins tightly as the Soul Eaters trotted along, hoping that they knew where they were going. But what if they don't? If they kept going west, they would surely reach the ocean. But were they even going west? Even if they did reach the ocean, there was no guarantee they would end up near the Holy Kingdom of Roble. Maybe they would end up too far south and then turn south, ending up lost forever. How did Ludmilla manage to get around in the wilderness? For that matter, she never seemed to get lost anywhere she went, even if she had never been there before. Her destination was 200 kilometers from where she had parted ways with her friend, but she couldn't tell how fast the Soul Eaters were going. It wasn't a road, so they moved erratically as they negotiated the hills and valleys along the way. Florine sucked in a breath as her Soul Eater leapt off of a cliff. She squeezed her knees together, but it wasn't a live horse, so she ended up wrapping her ankles around two of its ribs. The undead steed landed without breaking stride, then it turned a crimson eye at Florine. She suspected it was just trying to show off. Was it going to be like this every day? She hoped not, but she suspected that it would be. About 20 races had survived the demonic occupation of the Abelian Hills, but they were divided into roughly 120 tribes. The administration had an office in the same place where the Ministry of Transportation offloaded cargo, but she couldn't expect the demi-humans to travel for days and weeks to come and see her. The obvious solution, or perhaps the familiar one, was to have an itinerant court, much like many nobles did. She would travel around to hold court with each tribe, develop a rapport with the local leaders, and gain an understanding of their needs. It was unlikely that the demi-humans would be familiar with the practice, but that much at least she thought she could make work. Or would it make her seem weak? At least amongst humans, the most powerful made others come to them, then impressed their importance upon petitioners in various ways. Demi-humans most likely thought differently, though she couldn't say how. According to Lady Albedo's materials, the tribes of the Abelian Hills submitted to the Sorcerer King on account of his raw might, which he used to liberate their lands. Beyond that, however, there was no indication whatsoever as to how they viewed their new political ties. Thus far, there was verbal gratitude, but no record of tribute being offered. At the same time, she wasn't sure whether it was a common practice or under what conditions it was practiced. The tribes showed no sign of misbehaving, so that at least showed they continued to respect whatever it was that made up their respect for the Sorcerer King and his government. Or maybe it was just the Sorcerer King himself. Or maybe they respect strength and nearly everything that the Sorceress Kingdom deploys is ridiculously strong. That would be the worst case for her. If they respected the government because of the Sorcerer King, she might be able to leverage that association. If they were behaving because everything was stupidly strong, there was no way they would pay any heed to the weak little Florine Garnier without her resorting to forceful measures. An hour later, the forest gave way to a large river, which they forded just past the mouth of a wide canyon. The opposite shore had been cleared at some point in the past, though the brush was starting to grow back. Her Soul Eater turned south, following the rocky riverbank, occasionally stepping into the river to avoid clumps of bush and low-hanging branches. Things grew more arid the further south they went, and, eventually, the forested scenery was replaced by a broad valley lined by dry hills. In the distance, inside the wide bend of the river, she finally spotted what looked like a camp of some sort. Upon getting closer, it appeared to be a cargo lot operated by the Ministry of Transportation. Florine checked her pocket watch to see how long her trip had taken. As she approached the camp, the black portal of a gate spell opened in a trampled field near the rows of half-sized cargo containers. She stared as Lady Shiltier came through at the head of a long line of cargo transported by Death Knights. "Oh, if it isn't Florine," Lady Shiltier said. "You've finally arrived." Florine dismounted and lowered herself into a curtsy. "Good evening, Lady Shiltier," she sighed. What's wrong?" "I should have taken a gate here," she said. In hindsight, it was obvious, but she just went with the flow. Deliveries of supplies happen several times daily between Erantal and the Abelian Hills. Lady Shiltier came up and gave Florine a hug. "Or, are you tired? Would you like to sleep with me? I've been riding for 6 hours, my lady. Please don't squeeze my butt so hard." Mortals are so fragile. Lady Shiltier parted from Florine. You should hurry up and use that race change item. I still have no idea how this thing works. Could you at least tell me? Finding out is part of the fun, Lady Sheltier smiled. Now, what did that gorilla send you here to do? Florine straightened her skirts and pulled a folder out of her infinite haversack. Ostensibly to do what I did with the tribes around the Azalizia Mountains. She flipped the folder open and took out a map. But, I think there have been some flaws with the way I've been doing things so far. Oh my, Lady Sheltier's crimson gaze flared. How brave of you to say so. Brave, my lady? A vampire bride in a postal officer's uniform came up behind Lady Sheltier with a clipboard. Lady Sheltier received the clipboard and scanned through the attached documents. I don't suppose you've met the other humans that have been working for her, have you? You're probably not referring to the House of Lords. No. They aren't nobles, simply those whom she has wrangled into one venture or the other. None of them would dare think of reporting any errors to her. Florine frowned at the ridiculous claim. That's a huge problem, she said. Why wouldn't they report problems to Lady Albedo? Most likely because they fear her, or, more accurately, they fear what she will do to them upon hearing their reports. If they fear her, Florine said, then that's all the more reason they should be reporting those problems. Lady Albedo hates that sort of thing. You're not wrong, Lady Sheltier shrugged. I was actually wondering if you could shed some light as to why humans could be so laughably stupid. It's as if they want to be torn apart. She pondered the problematic behavior. It was unthinkable as an official of the Sorceress Kingdom, but... These humans that are working for her, Florine said. Which country are they from? Lady Sheltier tilted her head, giving her a curious look. I would have thought you would name the obvious choice. Unfortunately, there is no obvious choice, my lady. And why is that? Because the behavior you are describing is symptomatic of a corrupt society. Lying has become a survival skill. Aside from the Sorceress Kingdom and the Draconic Kingdom, there is no human society that we have interactions with in the region that doesn't display a significant amount of systemic corruption. Even the Empire? I can see why people might think that, Florine said, but yes, even the Empire has a high degree of corruption. Emperor Jerkniv's purges are akin to trimming a garden and similarly do nothing more than scale back growth. Corruption, however, is rooted in culture. Any society that promotes destructive factionalism and rewards people for lying and keeping their heads down invariably gives rise to corruption. I don't know if it matters, but my recommendation would be to dismiss these individuals immediately. Something irreparably stupid will inevitably happen otherwise. Humph. It's no wonder Albedo entrusts things to you and your friends. I've told you this before, but we've realized that there are a great many lickspittles out there. Individuals such as yourself are a rarity to the point of being impossible to find. In the case that we're discussing, there are only poor choices. Albedo expresses her frustrations, but, at the same time, she insists that things are still under control. Florine highly doubted that. It wasn't a matter of trust or Lady Albedo's exceptional capabilities. A machine didn't work if the parts didn't work, as Leanne would probably say. So long as one relied on others for anything, they were vulnerable to whatever those other people did. Everyone had a little bit of trust and a little bit of authority in whatever they did. Breaches of trust and abuses of authority added up, and, eventually, someone would have to pay an outsized penalty for them. Lady Sheltier returned the clipboard to the postal officer. She came over to wrap her arm around Florine's waist, leading her away from the cargo lot. I have no idea what Albedo has planned for the future, but you have your own task ahead of you, yes? What were those flaws that you mentioned? It's hard to put in words, Florine said, but something like unintentional bigotry. I've been going around with the assumption that our systems were the correct systems without ever really considering some very fundamental things about the other party. I think I know why Ludmilla calls integration a dangerous word, now. What's wrong with the Sorceress Kingdom's systems? Lady Sheltier asked. They're still being refined, for one, Florine answered. A year ago, the Sorceress Kingdom was populated by roughly 250,000 humans. Now, it has a population of 3 million and there are still only 250,000 humans. Yet, our systems are still for the most part made to govern humans. Lady Albedo wants our government to run as smoothly and efficiently as possible, but we can't do that if we go around assuming everyone is human. It felt like a strange thing to say considering that none of the royal court's ministers was human, yet, they were undeniably very human in their approach to things. At first, Florine thought that it meant that different races weren't so different, but then she found that most of the subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom did not behave as humans, nor did they perceive the world the same way. The Abelian Hills didn't have a human population, so trying to run everything as if everyone was a human was undoubtedly unwise. Hopefully, her work around the Azalisia Mountains could be amended after she was done here, as well. Florine looked around as they crossed into a landscape of scorched and blasted stone. Here and there, vegetation poked out from the ashes of whatever came before. Deathseer's servitors patrolled the perimeter, and, at the center of the area, a small collection of tents had been raised. They arrived at a large pavilion, where an elder lich and a vampire bride lowered their heads in greeting. Florine peered at the elder lich, her eyes settling on a pair of pins fastened to the collar of its black robe. Isoroku? Indeed. I'm so glad to see you. Florine blossomed into a smile. This makes things so much easier. Isoroku was the elder lich who acted as her adjutant while she worked with the northern tribes. It took a while for it to grow accustomed to working with Florine, but things between them went quite smoothly after a few weeks together. She commissioned the pair of silver pins on its collar to help her distinguish it from the other elder liches. They were the numbers 5 and 6, as the elder liches were identified by their summoning order, and Isoroku apparently meant 56. This child doesn't have a name, Lady Sheltier gestured to the vampire bride, but I've assigned her as your attendant for the duration of your duties here. She will serve as your handmaiden or bedwarmer or whatever else you please. Florine blinked at the introduction. The vampire bride didn't. Can she serve as a liaison for the Ministry of Transportation, as well? That's what you want? Lady Sheltier gave her a disappointed look. Well, yes, she also happens to be the head official for the Ministry of Transportation here. Thank you for your consideration, my lady. Anyway, that shipment should be just about done, so I need to get going. Please try and get everything sorted out here as soon as possible so I don't have to deliver meat 3 times a day. It's quite restrictive on my schedule, you know? I will see what I can do about that, Florine said, but, realistically, that probably won't happen until the highway from Warden's Vale gets here. Her liege let out a sigh and wandered back the way that they had come. Lady Sheltier was always ecstatic about any duty to His Majesty, so she was now probably framing her work here as slaving away for Lady Albedo. Florine took a deep breath, releasing it slowly before entering the main pavilion with Isoroku and the vampire bride at her shoulders. 6 elder liches stood silently around the table within. Good evening, everyone, Florine said. The elder liches lowered their heads in greeting as she joined them at the table. Are there any developments that I should be aware of before we get started? The situation remains unchanged in the Abelian Special Administrative Area, Isoroku replied. What is your command? Before anything else, Florine said, we must adopt a more comprehensive format for our documentation. The elder liches exchanged looks at her statement. Was the current format not devised by you, Lady Gonye? Isoroku asked. It was, Florine nodded. Improvements have been made. Going forward, our work cannot rely on such simplistic methodologies. I understand that many of you are probably fresh out of basic training, but I hope you will be up to the task. As one, the elder liches seemed to straighten, as if galvanized by her challenge. It looks like you're willing to try, at least, Florine smiled tightly. Let's take a look at our most up-to-date map. Bring out our logistical reports for the last week, as well. A scroll as wide as the table was unfurled and weights were placed at each of its corners. Florine narrowed her eyes at the same thing that she had noted in her meeting with Lady Albedo, which was the array of straight lines marking tribal territories. It was as if she was trying to turn the Abelian Hills into another Duchy of Erantal. Thankfully, the way that humans divided their territories accounted for a few essentials. There were many places with odd projections that attempted to accommodate the central administration's formulaic way of doing things, providing each tribe with access to water, forest, fields and, of course, the transportation network. Are the roads being laid in respect to these territorial divisions, Florine asked, or the other way around? It's a mix of both, Lady Gonye, the vampire bride replied. The main roads are planned along what our land surveys have determined are the most efficient routes, with service routes extending to the territories that they can't reach. Who did the survey work? Lady Aura. Since that was the case, there was likely no better way to lay the roads. That was a secondary problem, however. When were these territorial divisions determined? 1 month ago, Lady Gonye, Isaraku replied. So you're saying that everyone was moved into these territories marked here last month? Over the course of the last month, the Elder Lich told her. Some tribes were much slower than others. Was relocation even necessary? She could see the logic behind it, but the tribes probably didn't. Do we have a map of how things were before? Florine asked. Several smaller maps were brought out. Florine furrowed her brow as she tried to make sense of them. Were there problems with reporting? These look like no one can agree where anything is. No, my lady, Isaraku answered. Then was it some sort of seasonal migration? Unknown. The special administrative area is too large to surveil with our current assets. The special administrative area was subject to the same laws as the Duchy of Erantal, so the tribes probably weren't waging war on one another. Aside from them attempting to move around, she couldn't imagine what else they were doing, but that activity came to an end once the administration repainted the map. Did the tribes say anything when they were relocated? Any protests or petitions? No. What's with this utter lack of communication? In part, it might have been because they were dealing with the undead. Most people expected to be mercilessly slaughtered by them, and the Ganzu tribe minimized contact with the undead sentries posted around their territories. The fact that the undead administrators only cared for the tasks outlined by their work was probably the bulk of the problem. Anything that lay outside the bounds of their training was left to the discretion of living administrators, and the processes they observed were then sent for review by the central administration to create new processes. This probably won't work. Florine tapped the first map. Has the construction of these roads started yet? No, Lady Gonye, the vampire bride said. Gating both supplies and construction materials is prohibitively mana-intensive. We're waiting for the highway from the Sorceress Kingdom to connect with this region. If Lady Shiltir already knew that, why did she ask me to speed things up? As a noble and a merchant, she might be able to improve the logistical efficiency of their operations, but that required infrastructure in the first place. Was she suggesting that a skill or ability might exist that mysteriously moved things around without needing the means to move it? It's good that we haven't started on that yet, Florine nodded. Once we correct the territorial boundaries, we would have needed to redo everything anyway. How shall we begin? Isaraku asked. Florine cleared the old maps away and stared down at the first again. Her eyes traced the projected path of the new highway, which was arrogantly placed. It was being laid with a single objective, to connect the Sorceress Kingdom to the Holy Kingdom of Roble, cutting a nearly straight line through the Abelian wilderness. We'll start along the new highway, first, Florine said. Where are we right now? Isaraku leaned forward and tapped a bony finger on the map. Florine tilted her head slightly. The Dale of Defiance. Why is it called that? Florine asked. Unknown, the Elder Lich answered. The local tribes refused to approach the area, so it was an ideal location to set up our base of operations. I suppose we'll just have to ask around, Florine said. Let's start preparing the new document templates. We have a lot of work ahead of us. That was most likely a colossal understatement. Every race had different needs. Even if two tribes were of the same race, they probably had different histories and cultures. If she was to achieve His Majesty's mandates for the Sorceress Kingdom while also satisfying Lady Albedo's desire for order and productivity, Florine needed to lay the foundation for a system that transcended racial and cultural boundaries without trampling them flat. She had a few clues as to how to do so, which mostly revolved around her background as a merchant. As Ludmilla asserted, the concept of currency and markets facilitated many things, as they provided a shortcut for any race or culture to translate value into their respective comprehension. More importantly, they created a platform through which ideas could be exchanged and different peoples could learn how to interact with one another. This was how Ludmilla employed them, as a way to move goods around fairly and the means through which a collective culture might be achieved. It wasn't an unknown idea by any stretch of the imagination, but Ludmilla's focus on those aspects of the market did indeed result in a novel approach. Florine flipped through the logistical reports, occasionally glancing at the map on the table for reference. The trading post network that she established for the demi-human tribes in the north would probably be just as effective for that task in the Abelian wilderness. What she had to be watchful for was the rise of competitive tendencies that might lead to detrimental outcomes. You mentioned that our assets are insufficient for surveillance in the area, Florine said. What about our ability to maintain security and uphold order? Isoroku glanced at one of the other elder liches, who quickly went away and returned with a small binder. The presence of the royal army is limited due to geopolitical concerns, it said as it placed the binder in front of her. Geopolitical concerns? Florine frowned. Namely, the polities to our south, the elder lich told her. There are several kingdoms nearby in the great forest of Avasha. More importantly, the slain theocracy borders much of the wilderness. Have we had any run-ins with the neighbors, yet? None. However, as mentioned, our assets are limited, so we are not fully aware of their activities within our jurisdiction. A sense of dissatisfaction suffused the elder lich's voice. Considering the amount of control and awareness they usually enjoyed, its displeasure over the situation was understandable. Are you from the royal army? Florine asked. The elder lich nodded. For the time being, she said, our needs should revolve around domestic policing. Do we have any leeway when it comes to that? The Southeastern Army Group has several hundred infantry squads prepared for those purposes. The elder lich seemed to brighten. Shall I request their deployment? Not all of them. We'll bring them in as our needs demand them. How many of our new citizens live in those border areas? Distribution of the population is as shown on the map, the elder lich said. The entire population along our borders have been relocated to avoid unwelcome complications. I see. Being careful around the theocracy is prudent. We'll have to see if caution near Avasha is warranted. Isolating themselves from Avasha would do more harm than good if the existing relationships weren't belligerent in the first place. It was a priceless opportunity to peacefully expand the Sorceress Kingdom's influence southwards. Maybe they could even find out what was going on with the elves. Speaking of expanding influence, I'd like to know more about our situation along the western border, Florine said. I've heard some disturbing rumors about the state of the Holy Kingdom of Roble. Elaborate. My sources say that order is going downhill. The late Holy Queen's efforts to promote progressive policies and stamp out corruption are being reversed by the new Holy King. We don't want the product of that spilling over into the Abelian Hills. Plenty of discontent surrounded Queen Kalka's ascent to the throne of Roble, but the root of that discontent made itself overwhelmingly clear now. The Holy Kingdom was perceived as a bastion of the faith of the Four, but it was evidently far from the goodly realm that people made it out to be. Should we increase security along our western borders? Do we have any traffic from the Holy Kingdom? Not officially. And unofficially? Several groups have established themselves near the fringes of our territory, the elder lich replied. The Sorceress Kingdom's political stance toward the Holy Kingdom gives rise to questions as to our approach to their citizenry. Have they engaged in any illegal activities? Unknown. Then let's find out while we make our preparations here, Florine said. Bring in 10 squads from the Southeastern Army Group and reinforce our patrols along the western border. We may now have political ties to the Holy Kingdom of Roble, but our laws still make no distinctions between those who would challenge them. The following morning, Florine woke up to find the vampire bride kneeling beside her cot. Good morning, Florine yawned. Good morning, Lady Gagne, the vampire bride replied. You didn't have to be here all night. Our mistress ordered me to keep you from being despoiled. Florine sat up and stretched, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. I'm the only human in the area, she said. The biggest threat of being despoiled comes from Lady Schultier. I believe she intends to keep it that way, my lady. We must never disregard Lord Peroncino's wisdom. Lord Peroncino's wisdom, huh? Lady Schultier's father was an odd fellow and his wisdom asserted all sorts of dangers in the wide world. Maybe he was just a doting father trying to protect his daughter, but Florine had never heard of demi-humans and heteromorphs ravishing nubile human maidens or even expressing any interest in them. If anything, she enjoyed being around other races precisely because of this. There was no real point in disputing Lord Peroncino's wisdom, however. Florine threw back her blankets, shuddering from the chill. How could it be so hot during the day, yet so cold at night? After ensuring the vampire bride wouldn't do anything weird to her, Florian allowed her to help her prepare for the day. Despite being a handmaiden, the vampire bride couldn't cook or do most of what was expected of a personal attendant, so Florian had to prepare her own breakfast. She went over to the administration's pavilion, cradling a cup of hot tea in her hands. "Good morning," Florian said. "Did the requested security forces come in?" "They arrived an hour after you retired for the night," Lady Gagne, the elder lich from the royal army said. "We have dispatched them to the western borders to enact standard customs protocols. Let me know if they meet any resistance." "What about the new template?" "Copies have been prepared for the next week," Isaraku replied. "The escort and baggage train have also been prepared." "In that case," Florian said, "are we ready to go?" "The forward team has reported no issues," the army lich said. "We await your command." "Then let's go," Florian smiled. "Oh, let me finish my tea first." Her entourage consisted of Isaraku, 4 of the junior elder liches, the 2 soul eaters she had brought with her from the upper reaches, her vampire bride attendant, and 1 infantry squad. In addition, they were accompanying the latest shipment of provisions slated for the north. The elder lich from the royal army remained behind with 1 from the administration to coordinate things from their base of operations. They set off, going north up the river from where she had come. Burdened by the half-sized containers they were bearing, the procession took an hour to reach their first stop. Florian looked around at the arid surroundings, looking for any sign of the tribe being supplied with provisions. All that she could see, however, were the river and the shrubs along its banks. 1 set of death knights carrying a cargo container between them set down their burden. While 2 worked to pull back the top of the container, the other 2 went to pick up a pile of skulls that Florian mistook for a pile of stones. "What are they doing?" she asked. "Retrieving materials," Isaraku answered. "Materials for what?" "This tribe consumes their food raw, so any remains qualify as unprocessed materials." "In that case," Florian said, "why are they just leaving the skulls?" "Only one part of a corpse is required to raise new undead servitors." The Death Knights removed the cover of the wagon and started pulling out frozen beastmen corpses. Ludmilla would say that it's an efficient use of resources, but a queasy feeling filled Florian's stomach. The campaign in the Draconic Kingdom resulted in over 1 million beastmen corpses, but feeding people to other people still didn't sit right with her. She averted her gaze from the Death Knights, scanning the surroundings for any signs of the local tribe. They were supposed to be some sort of shelled rodent demi-human, but the descriptions in her materials weren't very helpful. "I don't see anyone." The last of the skulls flew into the container and the cover was replaced. Florian frowned as the Death Knights took up their burden again. "Are they not coming to get their food?" Florian asked. "They will only come out after the delivery has been made and the convoy has moved on," Isaraku answered. "Don't tell me this is going to happen with every tribe." "The shipments are on a tight schedule," the elder lich told her. "The convoys are not in the position to observe any changes." In other words, it was probably happening with every tribe. There was no reason for the tribes to risk themselves, all they had to do was wait for the undead to go away. "Then how do we know they're getting enough food?" "We have received no complaints, nor have we noted any anomalous behavior. There appear to be no issues with the initial estimates for provision." Florian urged her Solita forward as the convoy continued on its way. They were still 4 tribes away from the first one she wanted to speak to, but the way deliveries were being handled presented a problem. She had at least expected some representatives to come out to receive the shipments. How was she going to start a dialogue if they wouldn't come out at all? She quietly observed as the process repeated itself 3 more times. With no good ideas, she simply waited with the rows of dead beastmen left for the 4th tribe. The rushing waters of the confluence nearby filled her ears along with the sound of the wind through the stands of aspen along the water. "If they want to eat, they'll have to come out at some point." "Shall we retrieve one of the locals for you, Lady Gagne?" the elder lich sergeant asked. Florian briefly imagined a tribe of terrified demi-humans being pursued by the infantry squad. Except the descriptions were so bad that she couldn't figure out what the demi-humans looked like. She frowned down at her map before addressing her escort. "Have the infantry squad withdraw. Make it look like you're going away. The rest of you too." Everyone left, except for the vampire bride. If you fall into the demi-human's clutches, the vampire bride said, Lady Shiltir will be furious. I'd at least have a chance to talk with them if that happened, Florian muttered. Would they see the vampire bride as one of the undead? From a distance, they mostly looked like humans. Non-humans probably had trouble distinguishing them to the same degree. 30 minutes later, they caught the first sign of the local tribe. I see something, Lady Gagne, the vampire bride said. Where? In the trees above the riverbank to the southeast. Florian followed the vampire bride's gesture, but she couldn't see anyone. We won't hurt you, she called out. I'm from the Sorcerer's Kingdom. I'd like to speak with your leaders about a few things. If there was anyone there, they didn't respond. Maybe they would have better luck finding something like a village if they even had one. What was it like when you first came here? Florian asked the vampire bride. The same as now, the vampire bride answered. Everyone is very elusive. I'm amazed that we have any information at all on them, Florian said. The tribes to the north of Eranthal were nowhere near as cautious as this. If it was the orcs, would they be just as difficult to meet? Dull and his people were extremely wary as well, but they spoke readily once she got to know them. Hopefully, the other tribes would be the same way. 10 more minutes passed. Florian let out a sigh and went to sit on a small boulder nearby. The boulder pecked her in the rear. She jumped up with a shriek. Begone, pale hobgoblin thing. A shrill voice sounded, this land belongs to the GHK. Her assailant's voice was cut short. She turned around to see the vampire bride holding up a small, bird-like creature by the neck. How does that match the description at all? The reports did say that the tribe nearby was a race of avian demi-humans, but the person dangling in the vampire bride's grip didn't look like any bird that Florian was familiar with. It had a tapered beak with thin, wispy feathers in earthy hues that matched the arid landscape. It didn't have arms, only a pair of stubby wings that looked too small to fly with. Its three-toed talons kicked crazily as it thrashed in the vampire bride's grip. Shall I dispose of this, Lady Gagne? Of course not. Florian told her. Can you loosen your grip without losing it? The demi-human continued to thrash about. Unhand me, you ugly brute. How dare you do this to Leolio, champion of the Yimaiku? I'll GHK. The vampire bride tightened her grip again. Are you sure this one is worth your time, Lady Gagne? I can't exactly tell if you keep choking it. The vampire bride loosened her hold. Foul GHK. Florian frowned at the vampire bride as the undead handmaiden squeezed her hand over the demi-human's throat again. But it's fun, the vampire bride said. Aren't they citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom? Florian told her. You can't harm them for no reason. But it attacked you, my lady, the vampire bride said. A few centimeters to the left, and its beak would have entered your. I'm unharmed. It just startled me, that's all. The vampire bride set the demi-human down. It wobbled for a few seconds before falling over. Florian knelt, gingerly touching Leolio's soft body with the tips of her fingers. Are you all right? Eat me if you must, but Leolio will never break. I'm not going to eat you, Florian said. We weren't even. Well, technically, the vampire bride had been torturing the poor thing. Florian picked Leolio up, cradling the demi-human in her arms. The Yimaiku were probably the smallest demi-humans she had ever seen. Leolio wasn't even 50 centimeters long from the tip of its beak to the end of its tuft of tail feathers. Anyway, Florian said. You mentioned something about being the champion of your people? Leolio is not weak. I didn't say that. The avian demi-human squirmed around, righting itself and perching on Florian's arm. Leolio, he is the mighty champion of the Yimaiku. No one will harm his people. Leolio puffed up his feathers, looking left and right as he hopped back and forth. Eventually, he hopped onto Florian's head. How should I start with this one? Even Florian could tell that Leolio was rather weak, but he was also full of pride. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and he seemed to take his role seriously. What does your name mean? Florian asked. It is the sound of the wind through the rushes by the river, Leolio answered. Are all of your people's names like that? Do you think I could meet with them? Leolio hopped off her head, landing with a flutter of his stubby wings. He darted around, inspecting the handful of beastman corpses nearby. After several minutes of running back and forth, he raised his head and let out a nearly imperceptible cry. The sound of the wind picked up. It took a moment for Florian to realize that it wasn't the wind at all. A swarm of Liamiku appeared from the brush along the riverbank, forming a brown carpet that rushed toward them. They flowed around Florian's legs on their way to the beastman corpses and then, just as quickly, flowed back. All that they left in her wake were skeletons stripped of flesh. "Now, you have met them," Liolio told her. "Wait." The Liamiku champion stopped mid-step, regarding Florian with a beady black eye. "I still need to speak with your people," she said. "My name is Florian Gonye. I'm a human lord from the Sorceress Kingdom. I've been sent to assist with the administration of the Abelian Hills." "A human? I have never seen a human before. But I have heard the tales. Scrawny ape beastmen with steel shells and short arms. You do not match the description." Florian had never seen an ape beastman before, so she couldn't say if humans could be compared to them. According to her materials, the Abelian Hills had a species of ape beastmen called cabins. They had a population of roughly 60,000 before they were destroyed over the course of Yaldabaoth's cruel reign. "I assure you that I am indeed a human," Florian said. "The steel shells are just something that our warriors wear." "But if you say you are a lord, then should you not have a steel shell? Or maybe a mithril one? Human lords aren't always warriors." Liolio let out a piping laugh. "Nonsense," he said. "If human lords are not strong, then who will fight enemy lords? You would cease to exist." "Never have I heard such a foolish thing." "I've heard that dwarves come to trade here," Florian said. "Their lords don't necessarily have to be strong, either." "This is a lie," Liolio replied. "Dwarf lords are strong. The legends tell of the mighty dwarf lord who fought alongside the heroes of old to defeat the demon gods. He was as an unbreakable stone, wielding a mighty hammer that shook the earth with its thunder." Arg. When weighed against the law that Liolio accepted as truth, Florian's words failed to convince. She needed to find a better way to convey herself to those whose reality lay so far from hers. "You mentioned the demon gods," Florian said. "How do you know about them?" "Who here wouldn't know about them?" Liolio twitched his head to and fro. "The demon gods were defeated in the Abelian Hills." "Was that true?" "In human lands, the legend recounted the final battle with the demon god king, but, as far as she could recall, no location for the confrontation was given. She had always assumed that the bards were being tactful or cheating, allowing the imagination of their audience to paint the landscape for them. Then again, the written histories were the same way, which was decidedly odd. What would the world be like if people had known about it? Would the Abelian Hills be seen as a land of heroes instead of a desolate wilderness filled with savage tribes? Liolio seemed to see it that way, at least. "I didn't know that," Florian said. "That is strange," Liolio said. "Are your histories in such a sad state? There were humans amongst the heroes, you know?" "Of course I know," Florian replied. "The leader of the 13 heroes was human." She jumped at Liolio's high-pitched whistle. "That is a lie," he told her. "The leader of the heroes was Liamiku. Also, there were far more than 13. The incensed demi-human went on to recite dozens of names, most of which Florian had never heard before. "It's just the name that we have for them," Florian said. "Anyway, could you take me to speak with your tribe?" "Why do you want to speak with Liolio's tribe?" "As I said, I've been sent to help with the administration of the Abelian Hills. Getting in touch with the tribes and seeing what I can do for them is a crucial part of my work." Liolio fell silent, bobbing back and forth on his scrawny legs. Florian's head started to bob with his movements. "This Liolio does not know what can be done," he said after several moments. "But I will take you to see the others." The diminutive demi-human hopped onto Florian's shoulder and then her head. "We go," Liolio said. Where are we going?" "Silly human, you must follow Liolio's beak." Florian rolled her eyes upward, but she couldn't see a thing. "I can't see the top of my head," Florian said. "Can't you just lead me normally?" "This is normally." "How could that be? Did they always ride on other people's heads to get around?" Florian held out her arm. "At least stand where I can see you," she said. "Also, I'd like to bring some of my colleagues along. So long as there are not too many. Liolio can only defeat 3 or 4 of you." "Of course," Florian smiled. She looked across the river to a stand of aspen trees. I've convinced someone to take me to the tribe. Isoroku, come with me. The rest of you can wait here once we're on our way. Leolio's claws dug into her arm and he flapped his wings as if he could carry her away. Evil comes, he said, we must flee. Isoroku hadn't even left the trees on the other side of the river yet. Leolio's senses must have been extremely sharp. That's one of the colleagues I spoke of, Florine said. It's only just this one. You said that you could defeat 3 or 4 of us, right? Are you evil, as well? I don't see what evil has to do with it, but no. Isoroku is working as my adjutant. It won't do anything bad to you or your people. The demi-human continued to grip Florine's arm tightly, eyeing the approaching Elder Lich. He occasionally puffed himself up and flapped his wings as if to take flight. This is Isoroku, Florine said once the Elder Lich came up to them. Isoroku, Leolio. Isoroku simply stared. Leolio stared back. Florine gave her arm a shake. Let's get going, shall we? Leolio gave the Elder Lich one last, wary look before turning his head. Florine followed his strange manner of giving directions, making her way up an animal trail through the trees. Strangely, the way up the valley turned out to be easier than expected. You're a very good guide, Florine said. The demi-human on her arm raised his head and let out a satisfied-sounding trill. It is as I said, is it not? Leolio is the champion of the Yaimaiku. She wondered what that meant beyond sounding like a prideful boast. Tribal champions were usually comparable in power to lords, but Leolio didn't have any sense of being strong. Maybe it was because he looked more cute than dangerous. What else does a champion do? Florine asked. We stand and watch. The safety of the herd is our charge. The herd, not the flock. Leolio didn't reply, and they continued up the valley in silence. The trees grew more sparse as they ascended, and, eventually, they came to the top of the trail. A grassy vista strewn with huge grey boulders stretched out as far as Florian could see. Several Yaimaiku sitting atop the stones nearby rose to their full height and started making peeping noises. Alert! Alert! Danger! Evil! Intruders! Undead! Alert! Their warnings rolled across the hills as more and more Yaimaiku took up their cries. The birds, regular birds, nearby took flight and she spotted several animals bounding away. Everyone isn't going to run, are they? Florine asked. Maybe. Leolio is not sure. The Yaimaiku directly in their path scattered away while the others continued crying out their warnings. A kilometer from the top of the valley, they came to a small stand of trees surrounding a shallow depression in the hill. Hundreds of Yaimaiku stood before her, showing no sign of scattering as before. Florine swallowed, recalling how quickly they had stripped the beastman corpses to the bone. Leolio. A voice called out from the crowd, what have you done? A high-pitched clamor filled the air. Leolio seemed to shrink away. It seemed that he wasn't as important as he made himself out to be. My name is Florine Cadia d'Algogne, a baroness of the Sorceress Kingdom. I've been tasked with assisting the administration in the Abelian wilderness. The flock, or was it herd? Dash of Yaimaiku fell silent. What's a baroness? Someone asked. A human liar, Leolio said. A human lord, Florine corrected him. Liar. 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 Hundreds of high-pitched voices refuted her claim. Florine decided that claiming to be a human lord wasn't worth the headache. I've come to help the Yaimaiku. Maiku. An anguished cry filled the air. Maiku. Came another. Maiku. Maiku. Maiku? Florine frowned. We are the Yaimaiku no longer, the first speaker said. The Yai are gone, slain by Yaldabaoth and his minions. The Yaimaiku are no more, only the Maiku remain. Florine tried to figure out who was speaking, but they were effectively invisible in the sea of feathered bodies. So are the Yai another species? She asked, or is it something else? The Yai were our friends. Great beings many times the size of the Maiku. Many times your size, with 4 arms and 4 legs and a strong, bony shell. For an age beyond all memory we lived together, but that age is no more. A gust of wind punctuated the end of the speaker's unspeakably sorrowful explanation. Florine clenched her fists at her sides. Why would Yaldabaoth and his minions do something like that? She asked. Why do fiends do what they do? They claimed it would make us happy. Happy to be alive while the Yi were dead, and, because we were the Yi Mikyu, we would never forget our happiness because a piece of us is gone forever. I'm sorry. It was all she could manage. How was she supposed to help with that? She couldn't replace the relationship between one race and another. She couldn't even fathom what they had lost. Is that why you have come, human liar? To remind us of our great sorrow? No, Florian said, no. I didn't come to, I came to help, but I don't know what I can do for you. Are your people well fed, at least? Do you have enough territory to live on? We do not starve. As for territory, we do not know. The Mikyu have always accompanied the Yi, who ranged far and wide. Our territory spanned from the Barfolk to the west, the Orcs to the north and the Nek to the east. Now, it is much smaller. Then what was your relationship with Yi? We watched. We guarded. We tended to their great bodies and hunted the Afuli and Kiga who would come to infest them. They are gone now, too, destroyed by Yaldabaoth. Is that a good thing, or a bad thing? An entire people dying is never a good thing, human liar. Life fades, and the world becomes less. Florian looked over at Isoroku, who was busy taking notes. The Mikyu's problems were so intangible that she wondered if the Elder Lich understood that they couldn't be solved by improving logistics, adjusting borders, or implementing bylaws. Do you know of any other places where the Yi dwell? Florian asked. The swarm of Mikyu shifted as they exchanged looks. No, the speaker from before said. If the Yi still exist in the world, we do not know where they might be. I see. How about any other races you might be able to live with? Her question was met by a wall of puzzled expressions. There was only the Yi Mikyu, the speaker said. We know of nothing else. Then how about gainful employment? Florian asked. Your entire race seems to be composed of rangers, or at least your traditions give rise to them. There is a great demand for rangers in the Sorceress Kingdom, so we may be able to find places for you to fit in. A high-pitched buzz rose into the air as the Mikyu considered her proposal. Maybe it was a stupid idea, but she didn't have any better ones. Did the concept of employment even exist in their culture? She looked at Leolio, who was still on her arm, preening his feathers. He seemed to slip into his old ways upon agreeing to guide her, at least. Many of the words you use are unknown to us, the unknown speaker said. But a few of us will try, if only to fill the yawning hole that stares at us from inside our souls.